Hi, I'm Paul Edwards. I'm the author of the Mourner's Woods book series, and first and foremost, a monster kid. Tonight I'm watching The Haunted Palace from 1963, starring Vincent Price and Lon Chaney Jr. In the early 1960s, producer and director Roger Corman met a lot of success making film adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe short stories. Probably the best remembered of these is The Pit and the Pendulum. But he made a bunch of these Edgar Allan Poe adaptations. He also made other horror films, though, and at one point he was making a film version of H.P. Lovecraft's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. The studio liked the idea of this story being made into a movie, but they didn't like the title. And they said, why don't you just use another Edgar Allan Poe title that hasn't been used yet? How about this one, The Haunted Palace? And Roger Corman said, what are you talking about? This isn't an Edgar Allan Poe movie. And the studio said, it is now. So against his wishes, Roger Corman had to slap the title, The Haunted Palace, onto this H.P. Lovecraft movie and pretend that it was based on or inspired by the Edgar Allan Poe poem, which it wasn't. They threw a couple of lines of the poem in a couple of points in this movie just to sort of justify the title. But it really was just The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, the H.P. Lovecraft story. And what happens in this story is that a college-aged man, Charles Dexter Ward, becomes fascinated with an ancestor of his who had lived more than a century and a half ago, named Joseph Curwen, who reputedly had been a wizard who practiced necromancy, raising the dead to ask them for information from the spirit world. And the more fascinated Charles Dexter Ward became with his evil ancestor, the more devoted he became to learning and recreating everything that Joseph Curwen had done. In fact, he learned the spells to raise the dead and wound up resurrecting Joseph Curwen. Unfortunately, this whole thing was a trap set by Joseph Curwen back in the olden times. He knew that the townspeople were going to kill him, so he set a trap where one of his descendants would one day become fascinated with him and would raise him from the dead. And once that had been accomplished, Joseph Curwen killed Charles Dexter Ward and replaced him, living now in the modern world. That was the basic premise of the H.P. Lovecraft story. The movie version, however, had to change a couple of things. First of all, they cast Vincent Price as Charles Dexter Ward. Vincent Price was superb, but he was not 20 years old like Charles Dexter Ward was supposed to be. So they had to change the character of Charles Dexter Ward. He no longer was a college-aged young man. He was now an older, established man who had a wife, played by Deborah Paget. Incidentally, just as a side note, Deborah Paget is still alive. As of the recording of this video in July 2025, Deborah Paget is still alive. She retired from acting back in 1963, right after she had finished this movie, but she is still with us. So they changed some things about the character of Charles Dexter Ward, what his background was and so forth. They also changed the setting so that what was happening was that Ward was inheriting a palace off the shore of this town, Arkham, Massachusetts, which was a town that H.P. Lovecraft set a lot of his stories in. And Lon Chaney played a supporting role as, this is Lon Chaney Jr., mind you, played a supporting role as another necromancer who had been friends with Joseph Curwen back in the old days and was now helping Joseph Curwen to take over Charles Dexter Ward's life. This film really was the first feature-length adaptation of an H.P. Lovecraft story. and it was made during a time when H.P. Lovecraft was finally being discovered by the public. For those who don't know, H.P. Lovecraft was a writer who worked during the first half of the 20th century, writing mostly short stories for magazines, and he wrote in the realms of horror, science fiction, and fantasy. But unfortunately, during his lifetime, he really was not very successful. He had his followers, but he was certainly not a household name. And only after his death was he discovered, in a sense, by the general public. And now he's considered the greatest horror writer of at least the first half of the 20th century, before Stephen King. So, and his influence is monumental. So this really is a film that has an important place in history as being the first feature-length adaptation into the medium of motion pictures of an H.P. Lovecraft work. And it's one of the better ones, because there have been a lot of really bad Lovecraft adaptations over the years. I think one thing that makes The Haunted Palace work is that it doesn't try to use special effects to depict everything that Lovecraft had in his work. Joseph Curwen had this cavernous cellar under his property where he would keep caged the monsters that he had conjured from the spirit world. And wisely, Roger Corman did not try to replicate those monsters on screen. He left a lot to our imaginations with, glowing, eerie lights shining behind cell bars and, just a little bit of a glimpse of what might be lurking below, and your imagination had to fill in the rest. I absolutely think that was the smart way to handle Lovecraft, especially given that 1963 special effects never would have been able to portray what Lovecraft described convincingly. Vincent Price, of course, is excellent in everything that he did, and this was no exception. He did a great job playing a dual part, playing Charles Dexter Ward and playing Joseph Curwen. The way that they handled this dual role was different than the way it's portrayed in the actual story. In this Lovecraft story, Charles Dexter Ward conjures Joseph Curwen, raises him physically from the dead, and Joseph Curwen murders Charles Dexter Ward and replaces him because they look just alike. In the film, that's not what happened. In the film, it was basically Joseph Curwen's spirit, his mind and consciousness, and his evil soul were taking over the body of Charles Dexter Ward, but there was only one body between the two of them. So that was another change that they made for this film. But overall, I think that it really did capture the tone of Lovecraft's work. It didn't memorialize every detail that Lovecraft set out. I mean, it would have been a huge project to portray on screen the townspeople killing Joseph Curwen back in the old days with a cast of hundreds of townspeople storming the Curwen property. But Corman did the best job he could, I think, adapting it for the screen, given the constraints he was under. Incidentally, my favorite H.P. Lovecraft story is The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. And, so I'm biased in favor of this work, but Lovecraft himself didn't like it at all. He was very disappointed in this work, and he spent a lot of time on it too, compared to a lot of his other short stories. This was a longer project. It was one of the 3 longest stories he ever wrote, along with At the Mountains of Madness and The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. Lovecraft's work in Charles Dexter Ward was a complete disappointment to him. He wrote this off entirely. He thought it was trash. I think that, with all respect to Lovecraft, history has proven him wrong. I think it's his ultimate work, really. It embodies all of the Lovecraftian themes of cosmic horror, of inherited evil, of ancestry, and a malignant force that waits through the ages to strike. So, The Haunted Palace, is it as good as the actual written work, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward? No, I'm not saying that it is. But it's a pretty decent film adaptation. It's definitely worth catching if you haven't seen it already. Just don't expect it to be an Edgar Allan Poe story, because it's not, despite the title. Listen, if you enjoy vintage horror and classic monsters, you would love my book series, the Mourner's Woods books. My series doesn't have any continuing characters. It's just the opposite. It has a continuing location, a haunted forest in the American Northwest, Mourner's Woods. And in each book, a completely new cast of characters enters Mourner's Woods and finds, a new horror in every book. There's monsters and ghosts aplenty. And unfortunately, though, the worst threat that the characters inevitably encounter is the threat of their fellow characters who hiked in with them, because there's a lot of betrayal out in this forest. My books are available on Amazon.com. I have 6 in print right now. There may be more by the time you see this, because I average about 1 a year. My name again is Paul Edwards. My books are the Mourner's Woods book series. Thanks for letting me talk to you about Roger Corman's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, The Haunted Palace. And I'll see you in Mourner's Woods.